Thank you so much for coming out. I hope you learned something today, and yeah, well, let's get started. Georgia's Jewish community, Georgia started as a colony in 1733, and the first Jews arrived in Savannah in 1733. And I believe the colony began in February of 1733, and the first Jews arrived in Savannah in July of 1733. So Jews have been in Georgia just as long as any other non-native people in Georgia. The original settlers who came to Savannah, Jewish settlers who came to Savannah, were Sephardic Jews. They were originally from Spain and Portugal, and or their ancestors were from Spain and Portugal. And only 8 of the 42 original settlers were of Ashkenazic descent, which is people whose ancestors were from further east in Europe. And most American Jews today are descended from Ashkenazi Jews. Anyway, so this is a little quote from David Steinheimer, who was a peddler in Macon in the 1850s, so an early settler in Georgia, obviously. In his diary, he wrote, "I was born in Ickenhausen." I apologize for any pronunciations that are wrong. I was born in Ickenhausen, Bavaria, August 28th, 1839, not 1939. Received my education in a government school. Came to Macon, Georgia in 1856. My brother Isaac started me in my business career as a foot peddler. After I was out a few miles in the country, I became homesick, for I was a stranger in a strange land, not knowing the English language. I had a good crying spell, but I found that did not help any. So I proceeded on my journey. The first day I walked about 9 miles till sundown, stayed all night in a farmhouse, was treated as one of their own. After supper, I was the hero of the farmhouse. I could talk a few sentences. They wanted to know all about me, as well as my country and my religion. When I told them I was a Jew, they were astonished. They thought Jews had horns. And that stereotype apparently still exists today. My mother is originally from New York, and she went to college in Richmond, Virginia. She had never been to the South before. Her roommate had never met a person that she knew was Jewish. And she said, "Oh my gosh, where are your horns?" So I guess it didn't change at that point. Anyway. By the eve of the Civil War, the demographics of Savannah had changed. Like most of America, the South had been affected by an increase of immigrants from Western and Central Europe. Poverty, persecution, political disillusionment, and marriage restrictions, coupled with a utopian-like vision of possible opportunities in America, convinced thousands of Jews, particularly from Germany and France and other places in Central Europe, to immigrate to the United States. And most of them, or many of them, became these foot peddlers like David Steinheimer, where they walked around with packs on their backs and stopped at every house. And in the South, that was even more common than it was in the North, where more people worked in factories and things like that. While some new arrivals from Western and Central Europe decided to settle in Savannah, forever changing the demographics of the Jewish community there, others decided to venture inland to towns with names like Macon, Augusta, and Columbus. Those were originally the big centers of Jewish population in Georgia, as they were the centers of population in general in Georgia. They settled in communities that were growing and welcoming, and where an industrious individual with a pack on his back could be able to make a living. And this is Teddy Blumenthal, and he was a peddler in the North Georgia mountains. I believe his family was in Gainesville, in that area. This is Sam Lazarus and Nathan Friedlander, also peddlers in South Georgia and Adel. Once roots were established, marriage and families often followed. This pattern of settlement would be repeated over and over again across the state and would continue in the post-Civil War years and into the 20th century as more Jewish immigrants left the uncertainties of the old world for opportunities in the new. Just different pictures of different families throughout Georgia. The story of Jewish settlement does not end with the close of immigration in 1924. For those who don't know, the United States government passed an immigration restriction bill in 1924 that outlawed immigration from basically non-white countries, and they considered people from Eastern Europe to be non-white at that point. So many of the Jewish people that would have come here didn't, but still plenty did. They were establishing synagogues, like this one in Augusta, or this one in Macon. Benevolent societies. Oh, I have a typo in my next one, so apologies in advance for my typo in my next slide. Businessy, apparently. I thought this was a really cool picture, that they were establishing this barrel making factory in Bainbridge, which, if anyone knows, Bainbridge is known as the Oak City, and so they were using the oak to make their barrels. And businesses in the towns of Bainbridge, Fitzgerald, Quitman, and other towns just throughout the state. Strangely enough, the immigration to this area of Georgia, northwest Georgia, the Jewish immigration tended to happen much later, so that's why we haven't come to them yet. Although this I would say quadrant of the state probably does have the shortest and the least amount of Jewish history in the state of Georgia. Many of the people who were peddlers later settled, planted roots in different towns wherever they were, and they opened retail stores. And I'm sure you've all experienced different small stores throughout the state that, probably are no longer around anymore. But they established organizations. This was the Hebrew Orphans Home. It was obviously an orphan's home. It was an orphanage for Jewish children throughout the Southeast, or from throughout the Southeast. And then, and they considered orphans to be people whose parents could not care for them. So even if their parents were still alive, if they were not able to pay for their, if they were not able to care for them, they would send them to the orphanage where they would be taken care of, and they would be educated in, regular school and also Jewish subjects. They also created organizations in Augusta, Rome, and other places throughout the state. AZA right here, that's basically a high school fraternity for Jewish boys. The Jews of Georgia have taken part in every war since the Revolution of 1776. Right here, kneeling, the first from the right, so I don't know if my mouse doesn't show up. Well, you can count who's the first from the right. That's Sam Greenblatt. He was a very prominent Atlanta resident, and he was fighting in in Cuba during the Spanish-American War, and there are plenty of Jewish veterans from Georgia. They've become city council members, mayors, and legislators. They've joined fraternal organizations and have worked for the betterment of the communities in which they lived. The story of Georgia's Jews is laced with remarkable success, where Jewish women and men have been lauded as their respective cities' most respected citizens. Upon his death, David Mayer of Atlanta was eulogized throughout the city, and David Mayer is the guy on the left. Of David Mayer, it is next to an impossibility to write or put in the compass of a memorial the true character of this remarkable man. Indeed, his was a character that cannot be transferred to or shown on paper. There was something about the man so undefinable that to know him, you had to be with and commune with him socially. I guess he was so great they couldn't even describe him. So yes, as you can see, he helped found the Atlanta Public Schools and Grady Memorial Hospital, and I believe he was also one of the major benefactors of the Hebrew Orphans Home. So, unfortunately, it is also a story of disillusionment scarred by the lynching of Leo Frank and the bombing of the temple in Atlanta in 1958 by a white supremacist group. For the most part, Jews were welcomed by the Christian majority in towns across Georgia. Their numbers were small, and they didn't represent a threat to the status quo. In the antebellum South, most Jews were loyal to the Southern cause, fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War, and even owned slaves. While some Jews intermarried, and after successive generations lost any connection to their Jewish roots, others were able to maintain a balance between Southern loyalties and mores and Jewish traditions. Although a Confederate veteran and plantation owner, Raphael Moses of Columbus was responding to an anti-Semitic slur by a political opponent. His response to an anti-Semitic slur by a political opponent incited him to write one of the most often cited responses in defense of Judaism. Moses answered to this politician who slandered him for being Jewish, "Had I served you the extent of my ability in your recent political aspirations, and your overburdened heart had sought relief in some exhibition of unmeasured gratitude, had you a wealth of gifts and selected from abundance your richest offering to lay at my feet, you not have distinguished me more than just by proclaiming me a Jew. I am proud of my lineage and race. I feel it an honor to be one of a race whom persecution cannot crush, whom prejudice has in vain endeavored to subdue, who despite the powers of man and the antagonism of the combined governments of the world, have burst the temporal bonds with which prejudice would have bonded them, and after 19 centuries of persecution, still survive as a nation." Raphael Moses was, as you can see, he served as the chief commissary officer for General James Longstreet and Robert Toombs in the Confederate Army. And apparently, when people were angry in the 1870s, they wrote very flowery language. And that's him. How have Jews related to the non-Jewish majority in communities in which they've lived? The ease with which most Jews adapted to Southern society is evident by the numbers of politicians, civic and business leaders, and professionals who became well-respected members of the various small towns and communities, as well as larger cities in which they settled. This is Harold Hirsch. I see a few Georgia fans in here. I'm a Tech fan, so, boo. However, Harold Hirsch, the main building of the law school at UGA is named after Harold Hirsch. He was a football star and later served as the chief counsel for the Coca-Cola Company. So he was a real Georgia boy. This is about Lewis Cohen, who was in Sandersville, Georgia. And when he died in 1887, this lovely eulogy or tribute was written to him in the local Sandersville newspaper. And Cohen was a conspicuous and worthy representative to the class of American citizens, native-born and naturalized, who have done so much toward the rehabilitation of the South and developing her magnificent possibilities. So he was a German-born banker and came to the U.S. at age 3. His family settled in Americus, but he later moved to Washington County and became one of the most prominent citizens there. And he helped establish the first telephone exchange there. So I guess he didn't die in 1887. So I guess I was wrong about that being a eulogy, and it was just a tribute in the newspaper. So apologies for my error. And he also opened a bank in Sandersville, and I guess had his children's pictures in their stock certificate. So that's interesting. Of course, there is no evidence that that bank is in existence anymore. But how many local banks are still in existence? Unfortunately, as I said earlier, the Jews' position as a continuing and vital part of the community took a serious and devastating turn for the worse of the arrest, trial, conviction in 1933, and subsequent lynching in 1915 of Leo Frank, a female factory worker named Mary Fagan, who was employed at the National Pencil Company in downtown Atlanta, where he was the superintendent of the factory. And we can see Mary on the left here with her sister Ollie, and this picture was taken within a year before her murder. And Leo Frank, as a young boy or young man in 1902, probably when he was in college, he was convicted of murdering this young girl in her factory, although there was no actual physical evidence against him. It was the word of a night watchman there who said that he, basically because he was Jewish, he had certain proclivities towards young girls, which people like making up things. That became a real powder keg in Atlanta and all over the South and even all over the country. The publisher of the New York Times continued to write in his defense. He was convicted on the testimony of this night watchman, and unfortunately, the night watchman was African American, and in the court case, his testimony, it was the first time that a court believed the testimony and over. Fortunately, sorry for my, it was a very difficult situation, obviously. He was convicted and sentenced to death. However, Governor William Slayton wrestled with whether to commute his sentence to life in prison because there was no physical evidence. And he basically ruined his own political career by commuting his sentence to life in prison. However, a few months later, a group of vigilantes from Marietta, which is where Mary Fagan was from, and calling themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan, came down and basically broke him out of the jail cell in Milledgeville, which is where he was, and brought him back up to Marietta and lynched him, which was obviously that picture that I had shown before. And to this day, there's never kind of really been a definitive answer on whether he was guilty or not guilty. A boy who worked as a child in the factory, a young African-American boy, on his deathbed in the 80s, later claimed that he saw the night watchman carrying Mary Fagan's body before Leo Frank would have even known about this happening. So there's still controversy over this to this day, and nobody knows for sure what happened. Anyway, that really made a lot of Jewish people scared to stand up against unfairness and things like that. During the turbulent civil rights era, few Southern Jews became actively involved. After all, it was one thing to be an outsider Northern Jew who came down to march and protest and to rabble-rouse, as they would say. It was quite another thing to speak out and remain friendly in your own community with your neighbors. Even by the 1950s and 60s, most Southern Jews remembered the Leo Frank case. Charlie Lebanon, who owned Leb's restaurant, refused to integrate his restaurant, even after the NAACP picketed outside. It was a downtown restaurant. And he ended up, even after the Civil Rights Act was passed in, 1965, He ended up closing his restaurant rather than integrate. The B'nai B'rith Lodge, which was a fraternal organization for Jewish men in Waycross, Georgia, actually withdrew from the national organization because of its liberal position toward integration. Of course, there were some notable exceptions. Men and women whose stance on social issues not only disrupted the status quo in the general community, but whose voices sent shockwaves through the Jewish population as well. Rabbi Jack Rothschild, the leader of the temple in Atlanta, was one of Atlanta's leading voices of change during the civil rights movement. He used his pulpit to advocate for desegregation and equality. Rose Esserman Levin, from right here in Northwest Georgia, along with her husband Jewel, were some of the most prominent civil rights leaders in Northwest Georgia. Esserman's, the store the family owned, was the first retail store in Rome to allow black customers to try on clothes and shoes before making purchases, to employ black people as salespersons, and to address all customers, regardless of race, as Mr. or Mrs., as opposed to their first names. Rose was a founding member of the Rome chapter on the the Georgia Council of Human Relations. And, today, that kind of ends our kind of chronological part. We have a little bit about Rome and Dalton, which were the two major communities in Northwest Georgia to have at least somewhat of a substantial Jewish population. Rome is the largest one, and early Jewish settlers began to arrive in Rome in the 1850s. They were mostly German Jews who, as I had discussed earlier, peddled around Northwest Georgia and decided to make Rome their home. So they opened stores. They organized Congregation Rodef Shalom in 1875. Something I thought that was interesting that I learned when I was researching for this presentation. Rodef Shalom in Hebrew means pursuers of peace, which is pretty salient because they organized this congregation 10 years after the Civil War ended, and General Sherman encamped in Rome, and a lot of businesses and homes were destroyed during that time. And so they were pursuing peace. Rome's most well-known Jewish family was the Esserman family that I just mentioned, their daughter Rose, who owned Esserman's department stores. Anybody here familiar with Esserman's? Okay, just a few.
I was the past president of that temple. My wife was the current president of Rodef Shalom.
Well, thank you for coming.
We know a descendant that still lives there, Charlotte Keller. She's a descendant of the Esserman family.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Esserman's department store stood on Broad Street for almost 100 years. The Jewish population of many small towns throughout the U.S., not just in the South, has dwindled, as well the population of many small towns has dwindled. Younger people may not be as interested in following along in their families' retail businesses, and they end up going to college and then settling in larger cities such as Atlanta or New York, and never coming back to their hometown. Rodef Shalom is still active, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but there are currently 2 rabbis that take turns leading services.
Right, Rabbi Lebo and Rabbi Meyer.
Yep. And they come up from Atlanta and take turns leading services each Friday. And Rome is about 25 miles from here? And of course, there's also Dalton, which has a very, I wouldn't say young age-wise, but young in how long Jewish people have been living in Dalton, only since about the late 1880s. Whereas Rome, people were settling there in the 1850s. They began attracting large waves of migrants from all over the country and all over the world in the late 1800s, when large cotton mills began to dominate the landscape. Widespread manufacturing employment, particularly in the cotton bedspread industry, And later, the carpet and flooring industries attracted large crowds of workers from around the world. Many Jews came to work in those factories, manage them, or open businesses that catered to the booming population. And in 1941, the local Jewish community founded Temple Beth El, which was a conservative congregation that means light of God. The synagogue building was dedicated in 1947. Again, like Rome and other small cities, the Jewish population has dwindled in Dalton because large big box stores have put mom and pop shops out of business. And many of those shops were owned by Jews. And from what I can gather, please, if anybody knows, correct me if I'm wrong, Temple Beth El does not appear to currently be active. Okay. Wow, that is really fascinating. I didn't know that. I had heard, I didn't want to type up all these notes and end up just reading everything, but I had read when I was doing my research on this that after World War II, there was a huge boom in the Jewish population in Dalton. Well, actually, there was a huge boom in the population of Dalton with increased manufacturing, of course, obviously in the carpet industry. And many people came and either bought factories or opened their own factories. And also it brought in a lot of college-educated folks who were there to manage the factories, which was pretty unusual for a smaller town, particularly in the South, that there was such a high level of education in Dalton in that time. But yeah, that is it for my presentation. Here's my email address if anybody wants to contact me. And I would love to answer any questions you have now. Yes?
Can you tell us about your museum?
Sure. So the Bremen Museum is the Jewish History Museum in Atlanta. A lot of people don't know that we have a Jewish History Museum here in Georgia, and we do. And I'm living proof. It is in Midtown Atlanta. If anyone knows where the Center for Puppetry Arts is, it's literally right next door. So it's on the corner of Spring and 18th Street in Atlanta. So I welcome you all to come down and visit. Right now, due to the pandemic, we're only open on Sundays. Hopefully in the new year, we'll be more up and running with more weekday opening hours. So we are Georgia's Jewish History Museum. We focus on the Jewish history of Georgia and Alabama, as well as the Holocaust. And we have a Holocaust gallery. It's very popular with school groups that come in, and it teaches all about the history of the Holocaust. But we also have a special collecting focus on Holocaust survivors who later settled in Georgia and Alabama with their family and created families here. And we still, unfortunately, as time goes on, we've lost a lot of our Holocaust survivors. And in the past few years has, just like with every community, has been pretty rough on our Holocaust survivor community. I believe we've lost about 8 of our speakers who came and regularly gave talks about their experience. Because almost all of them are in their 90s now. But we still do have a few, especially the younger, more vibrant, more active survivors who come and they give their testimony about what they experienced during those terrible times. So that is a little about our museum. And one more thing, we just opened a brand new exhibit called History with Hutzpah. And it's all about kind of the hidden treasures of our archives, which I'm the archivist, so I like that. And all about some people who were kind of, who had chutzpah, Southern Jews who had chutzpah. As I said, Georgia and Alabama. The reason we don't do any other states is because there's a museum in New Orleans that deals with the states more to the west. But our new exhibit just opened on, I believe it was September 19th. So it's brand new, and it's going to be up for at least 3 years. And I really would love if you all came and visited and took a look around and maybe learned a little bit about some of the people that learn a little more about some of the people I mentioned, about people with chutzpah and nerve who stood up for what they believed in, and made our state of Georgia and the state of Alabama a better place.